Hi, everyone, and welcome to Keeping Students in the Reward State of Mind. I'm Danielle Boheis, and today we are going to focus on how to get to know your students at a deeper level by understanding some concepts rooted in brain science. We're going to spend a little bit of time exploring the brain science behind a student's perception of how connected they are in the classroom and the impact that that can have on their emotional well-being and ultimately their ability to develop to their full potential. We're going to spend some time learning how to increase some innovation, engagement, and development by understanding and supporting your students on a deeper level. We're also going to think about and learn about how to apply emotional intelligence to keep students in that reward state of mind. I wanted to take a minute to introduce myself. I have spent almost my whole life being involved in Catholic education. I went to Catholic school from kindergarten to 12th grade. I was a Catholic educator for 8 years in the Catholic schools, and then a leader as an instructional technology specialist at our local Catholic high school. And now I'm a Catholic school parent. So I'm really passionate about the work that you all do with our students, and I'm really excited to be here today. I want to start with a little story to begin our time together. This is Jesus. I taught middle school in a K-8 building for a number of years, and Jesus was one of those students that was pegged for being a high flyer for behavior throughout elementary school. He was always looking for attention and seemed to only get that attention by doing negative behaviors and acting out. So I watched many teachers previously just dismiss him when they came into their classroom, really just not understanding him to the deepest degree. So I made it a point to connect with him. I really knew that this would make a difference with this student. And so I tried my best to have a relationship with a student before he even walked in my classroom, his year of 7th grade. So he would come into my classroom because I spent time getting to know him and understanding him at a deeper level. And he wasn't perfect, right? But he did come in and generally behave because his state of reward was present in his brain when he came into my classroom because of our relationship. So that's what we're going to focus on today. I want to begin with a brief explanation of how our brains work when it comes to threats and rewards. Our brains are constantly scanning our environments to determine if what is being felt or seen is a threat or a reward to us. If it's a threat, your brain is going to signal your body to get away from it. It doesn't feel good. However, if it's a reward, it wants more, right? It feels good. We want to do more of those things. The sense of whether something is a threat or a reward happens to us about 5 times a second. So that's an incredibly fast amount of time, and we're not even normally aware of it. Our bodies just react. So that's what we're going to focus on today. With every personal interaction that you have with your students, whether you're in person or online teaching virtually or a combination of the two, students' brains are trying to determine if they feel connected in a positive way to the people that they're interacting with. So this is really applicable to students to keep them in that reward state of mind so that they're able to innovate and learn. To start us off, I'd like you to think of a time when you responded in a way that you later regretted. Maybe you said something or acted in a way that is out of your character. Later, you probably thought about it and thought, ooh, I would love a redo. I probably didn't respond the correct way to that situation. I'm going to challenge you to think of an interaction between a student or a group of students or a parent or whatever that might be for you. I'll share an example to give you a few moments to think. So it was a Friday afternoon. It had been a really difficult week. There were multiple behavior situations in my classroom. We had a few different schedule changes, so things were a little rough. I was working with my reading group, and students were working in their small groups independently. And they were, they had tasks that they had to do, and they did these things daily. But no one seemed to be paying attention on this day. No one was following the expectations. It felt like everyone was ignoring everything I had asked them to do. And I lost my patience and completely overreacted, expressing my disappointment and frustration when really, probably when I looked back on it, was just a Friday afternoon after a really long week of multiple things happening. And that was probably typical for my students. I was probably asking too much of them. Can you relate to that? I'm sure many of you can. Grab your pad of paper or something that you have at your desk and write down a situation that happened to you. It's really great for your brain to sit down and reflect. How did you feel at that moment? What emotions were you experiencing? Who was affected by your actions or words? If you'd like to take some time to reflect, pause the video now for a few seconds and then come back to the presentation. So we're going to start by talking about threat versus reward. I briefly touched on it a second ago, but what's really happening in those times that we just reflected on? What's happening in our brains? Why are we reacting like that? Keep in mind, this is what happens to your students as well, right? They are just like us, so we need to keep that in mind. So we have an amygdala on each side of our brain, and that is constantly scanning our environment to determine what we are seeing, hearing, or feeling, and whether or not that's a threat or a reward. And this happens fast, like I said before, up to 5 times a second. The thing that's interesting though, is that it doesn't differentiate between a physical threat, like a car veering at us or someone coming at us, or an emotional threat, like someone is mad at us or we've gotten into a disagreement with someone. It treats both of those things the same. And based on what it determines, it tells your brain, this is a threat or this is a reward. So when your brain senses a threat, when that amygdala senses a threat, it signals to release cortisol into your prefrontal cortex. And if you know anything about the brain, your prefrontal cortex is where all of your processes happen, right? This is where our memory is stored. This is the way we problem solve. We use all those things. So if cortisol takes that and freezes that part of your brain, all you're left with is your stored memory of how you either done something in the past or reacted to in the past, even if it didn't go well, right? Even if we've overreacted in the past, when we're sensing a threat, our prefrontal cortex shuts down, we lose all ability to use our thinking processes. So instead of problem solving that situation or learning how to do something or taking a minute to assess what's going on, our default is to pull from that past experience. So the situation I asked you to reflect on earlier is an example of this response in your brain. And we call it an amygdala hijack. That's what it's called. Your amygdala is hijacking the rest of your brain. And when the prefrontal cortex shuts down, you experience decreased innovation and problem solving skills, and you lose your emotional control and creativity. Another thing that happens is it takes that cortisol and it shoots it down to the digestive system, which is why at times you'll feel like those butterflies are uncomfortable feeling in your stomach when something's happening. Another chemical that's released is adrenaline, and that's energy to your muscles. So that's when you hear stories of people lifting cars or running really quickly, your adrenaline kicks in and you've got a burst of energy to those muscles so that you can fight, flight, or freeze, right? You can flee the scene if you need to. When the amygdala assesses the situation and says, hey, this is great, I don't need to fear this, dopamine is released. And dopamine functions as a neurotransmitter, which increases the signals that your neurons are able to send to each other. You can create other thoughts, you have higher innovation, you can connect ideas to each other, and you have higher collaboration rates. So it's our job as educators to create this environment when our students' brains lean more into that reward state. And that's what we're talking about today. We want to increase the dopamine that students are feeling and understanding in their brains and turn it into their ability to innovate and problem solve and collaborate. So what I'd like to focus on is how can we minimize the sense of threats in our classrooms? So we're going to identify some of those threats. And then how can we keep those students in the reward state of mind? First, let's identify a few things that might be a threat, right? Test taking. Test anxiety is so real. Many of our students have it. My own daughter has test anxiety, especially with those math minutes that they do. It can lower students' self-esteem and confidence, and typically they start to fall behind in their academics. A change in routine is something that's really difficult for children because they thrive on that. So when they don't know what to expect or don't know how to react, that can send their brain into a loss of self-control because they don't know how to respond. Home life. This is something that we can't control. Students come to school with emotional stressors that we may or may not be aware of. It's our job to try to pull that information out of students and understand them at a deeper level so we can meet them where they're at and support them in their threatened state, bring them back to the reward state. And then, of course, there's social situations, which we have all experienced as children ourselves and see in the classroom with our students. So students who are experiencing any level of bullying or social pressures from friends or recess issues, that all can evoke a threat response in our brains. Rewards for students. So when we think about what's a reward, there's lots of great things that we do in classrooms that we already know about. Connection breaks. Giving students time to connect and build relationships with their peers, letting them have fun so their innovation can shine. That's something that we do really well in our Catholic schools. I've seen it time and time again. I tried to build this into my classroom whenever I could. Clear expectations. When students know the routine and the expectations, they're in a reward state of mind. They can think better, they can innovate, they can be creative, they can learn. Positive encouragement. Help students gain confidence and become more aware of the things they're doing right. And students and teachers can participate in this, right? We don't have to be the only ones as teachers. We're going to encourage our students to fill each other's buckets as well. And then practice, right? Allow students time to practice and provide feedback and encouragement as they work. We need to give students chances so that they feel safe. So back to that situation when I asked you to do that self-reflection and identify any physical signs for the list that I'm going to post next that you noticed or were experiencing. Did you experience any of these? Because I know I did. I always have a little bit of the increased heart rate when something's happening. I can have tunnel vision. I can, in certain situations, not with students necessarily, but tears are something that I've worked really hard on, identifying what threatens me, what my triggers are, and then trying not to have that tearful response, right? Of course, disengagement and defensiveness, those are really highly likely things that you're gonna get from kids. Disengagement, they're gonna shut down. They're not thinking, they're not doing anything, and that defensiveness. I didn't do this, it wasn't my responsibility. So we're gonna try to avoid that. We're gonna learn about the SCARF acronym, and that was developed by David Rock. And it's all based in the brain science that we talked about before. So we're gonna identify some threats and some rewards to identify some triggers that will be present for students and for yourself. So I want you to think about that. What are your triggers as we go through these? You'll start to identify really quickly. And then what are some triggers that you can see in certain students that you work with? So S is the first letter, and that stands for status, or what our sense of importance is in relationship with others. So this is what triggered me in my situation that I shared with you earlier. I took it personally. I thought that students were challenging my authority, essentially. And this is something that I know about myself, and I have worked really hard to avoid this trigger and to get my brain to understand that it's not always about me. It is about what students are experiencing in the classroom as well. Some students are picked last for teams. That can create that threat status trigger for students, right? When they're picked last for teams, other students are higher up on the hierarchy than they are, right? That can be a threat. Not invited to the birthday party, being called out in class. Some of those things are really difficult for students to get over. And when we bring students back in from recess, we need to be mindful of what happens after that recess time to provide students a time to reconnect, to be curious about what's happening, to bring them back into the reward state of mind, because those can all be triggers. And if we want students at their best, with dopamine flowing through their brains, we have to get students to think about that. So positive encouragement is something that we can do. We can always provide positive encouragement. We can have students practice that as well. Public recognition for students or private. When we start to ask students how they want to be recognized in class, some students do not want to be recognized publicly in class, and that's okay. We can write them a little note or send a parent an email, whatever that looks like. And then being asked to lead an activity or a group. That can provide students status within a group, within their small group breakouts, or however you're doing things, whether virtual or in person. Great ways for students to get to level the playing field there a little bit. And then I'd like to provide an activity. So we're going to go through these SCARF, SCARF acronym, and then I'm going to show you an activity every single time. So this activity is really about identifying your superpowers. And really that is about asking questions to students that help them identify their positive character traits. What do they do at home to help people? What do they do at school to help people? What is their superpower? Some students are really great at reading and can help other students in the class do that. Some students are a whiz at math facts. Some students will always offer to help. Those are superpowers, and we should be recognizing those. So we'll have some resources for you at the end that you can start doing some of these activities in your classroom to heighten that reward status when it comes to status. C is the next one. And this stands for certainty. So we have a number. My daughter has this as a trigger for her. Certainty, she needs to be able to make accurate predictions about what is going to happen. Unclear expectations is a threat for her, right? And I know that's a threat for many students. Not knowing what's going to happen or what's going to happen if I don't do something in my classroom or school, that can trigger students. Substitute teachers. Now I know that we can't do anything about this, but going over procedures can be a really great way to help students feel okay about what's going to happen if you're ever gone. A change in schedule. That was what was happening in my reflection that I shared with you all. Students don't do well with that most of the time, unless you have a lot of conversation with them before that. That can be difficult. And then no established routines. Those are also extremely difficult for students. If they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, they're not going to have a great sense of certainty. And then, of course, COVID. I know we've been focusing so heavily on COVID this year, and I know we're all tired of it, but this is really something that we should be mindful of, especially students who are involved in extracurricular activities. These students are deeply affected by this. Their circles of friends and things that they do and are involved in are all shut down right now in different parts of our country. So it's been difficult for students, and everything looks a little different. So let's just be sensitive to that. And then the reward state. How can we keep students feeling good about certainty? So we can be transparent. And a lot of us do this already, but understanding that that is directly related to a trigger that might send students off into not being able to think or innovate or be creative or do their work is something we should be mindful of. Having clear and consistent expectations, and really allowing students to understand that mistakes are okay, and we model that, right? I used to be the first one to point out mistake that I made, whether it was in grammar or spelling or did something wrong on the board or didn't change something. We need to show students it's okay. And then the activity here is really thinking about how do we involve students in understanding what the expectations are for class. What does it look like? What does it sound like? Those types of activities are really great for engaging students and allowing them to feel empowered that they made some of those choices so that they can stay in that reward state of mind. A is for autonomy, the sense of control over things, right? So what is a threat? A threat could be no flexibility. We can't provide flexibility for everything, but when we can, we should. That can allow students to feel that empowerment. Lack of empowerment, lack of choices in daily work, and then a mandated learning environment. So how can we take those things and flip them to make them a reward state for students? What can we do? What can we control? We can give students the ability to organize their workload and teach them how to do that. Students don't know, some of them, my son included, doesn't know how to organize his workload, but when you give him a choice over doing math or reading or sight words, he will feel control over that and then be in a better state of mind to do his tasks. Offering choices is always great. Flexible work locations, depending on what activities you're doing, you might be able to provide a distance way for students to be learning in your environment. And then authoring goals and action steps. This is really great, especially for those older students. They're doing NWEA goals or reading goals or math fact goals. Have them set goals for themselves. Think about where they're at and where they need to be and provide action steps. Have those conversations with students. That gives them great autonomy over what is happening with their schoolwork. And then a really great activity that we can do with students is thinking about what learning style they have, taking them through an activity to reflect back on what their experiences have been like. What do they remember learning? What had they have to do for that certain concept? Did they have to dress up and perform something? Did they have to sing about it? Were they able to create a project with that? Was it a digital project? Was it handwritten? Those things can help students start to identify and have control over what they do. And then as a teacher, you know how to meet that student's need and differentiate for that student. R is for relatedness. And it's really about the sense of connection with others. I've never walked into a Catholic school and felt a disconnect, right? It always feels like a family and a community. And I know that we are really good at this, but there's always room for improvement. So some threats that could affect trigger a student for not feeling connected or related. COVID, right? We've separated our students in ways. We can't group them in certain ways in our classrooms, and we can't do certain group work. So that can be difficult. Feeling unknown to others or not noticed. Didn't ask about my weekend, didn't ask about something that's going on. I'm not really sharing any good news in my class. Feeling excluded, not going to the birthday party, not being invited on things, not being able to play at recess with each other. Disingenuous responses. This is a big one. This is something that I've had to work on as well. And this is really about your mood, your outward appearance, your facial expressions, matching what's going on inside of your body. So if you are really upset and you're trying to smile and you're saying, yep, it's fine. Yep, it's fine. That can be a really disingenuous response, and students are going to pick up on that. And students do that with each other too. So it's just a really great thing to be aware of. So how can we make sure that students are feeling connected and related and a sense of belonging? We can apply mentor and coaching programs. Our school does something called Super Friends. I'm sure many of you do something like that. And although we have COVID right now, they've figured out really cute ways to have students be connected through pen pal letters and different things that are happening and being passed to our students. That's a great way to get students feeling like they matter to someone else. Belonging to a team. Whether you have little teams in your room that you're doing some fun competitions with, it can be really heartwarming for students and keeping them in that dopamine state of mind that they belong to a team or a group. And then having authentic relationships with different students in the classroom. Understanding your students to a level that you might be able to connect them with things that they're interested in outside of school. Maybe it's not schoolwork that brings them together, and maybe they both really like to play this certain video game, or they're on the robotics team and this other student is really interested in that. Maybe it's Legos. There's tons of things that we can learn about students and try to create that sense of belonging in our classroom. And then the item of significance. That's a really great activity to create that community feel and allow students to see that every single person has something that's special to them. And it might be something that invokes an emotion in different students. I have done this with my students, and it's been amazing to hear how each student is affected by this and the stories that are shared. It's very, very powerful. And then F for fairness. A just and non-biased exchange between people. And this is a really difficult one to get students to understand, that Fair is not always equal. Some students might need something that you do not, and vice versa. You might need something that other students don't, and that's okay. So a threat, something that would trigger lack of rules or expectations, really difficult as students move into different places with different teachers, middle school level, specials, some of those types of things. Unfair consequences, when students haven't been empowered to understand and create some of those classroom agreements, and they don't understand what the consequences ahead of time, they can perceive those as unfair. Varying levels of support outside of school. So our schools are in all different kinds of communities. Sometimes these students have parents and grandparents who are super supportive and can help them. Some students go to daycare or babysitter after school, and they don't have the same types of support. So we need to be really mindful about how we assign work outside of school and what level of support students might have. Some students might need more of us, and we do a really great job with that. Rewards. So students' input for classroom culture, a really great way to involve them is to empower them. What does it look like in our classroom when we have positive classroom culture? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? Some of those things are really great activities to do with your students. Equal opportunities. So we provide different choices and opportunities for students, and all of them have the same thing. Mentor opportunities, as I mentioned already. Something that's really interesting, this activity is called the Band-Aid lesson. And really what happens is students act out different injuries. Maybe that have happened to them. They stubbed their toe, or they cut their finger, or they fell off their bike. It's a sports injury, whatever. And you have all of them act out different injuries. They can pick whatever. You don't give them any other inclination. Then after everyone has had their fun, it gets a little loud. What you do is you pass out a Band-Aid to each student, and that's how you're treating the injury. Every single injury gets the same treatment, and that's a Band-Aid. And so the discussion evolves, and students start to understand that a Band-Aid isn't going to treat a broken bone. A Band-Aid might treat a cut, but it's different and looks different for every single injury. So that can help bring them their awareness about the fair is not always equal mentality. So we've gone through this long list, right? SCARF, S for status, C for certainty, A for autonomy, R for relatedness, and F for fairness. But what do we do with that? How can we, beyond those 5 activities that I shared, and I should go back, there's a QR code here that you can find that activity at. I'm so sorry, I forgot to mention that. And I also have it at the end. But how can we start to do this? What can we do ongoing in our classrooms to support students? And one concept is this one-on-one coaching. So we can ask students what they're most excited about in a year. We can empower them to have those conversations and to start to make decisions about how we spend our time in our class. Do they love project-based learning? Do some of them love writing papers? Do some of them love research? Do some of them love science labs? We can start to understand that at a deeper level so we can empower students to be involved in their learning. What keeps them up at night, right? How can we start to understand a little bit more about students and what's going on outside of school? How can we ask those questions and relate to students so that they know that this mental health, this is a big deal and we need to support this. And me as the teacher, I have things that I worry about too. So modeling those expectations are going to be really, really important. Academic goal planning, that's a really great way to allow students to feel some autonomy, what they're grateful for. Again, when you talk about gratitude practices, those things, that dopamine that's released, that's a feel good, right? That's a feel good thing. And so when we think about things that we're grateful for, it's an excellent way to get students into that reward state of mind, whether that's a weekly practice that you do, whether that's something daily that you do. And then I'm into how are students involved outside of school? It's really important for you to know these things and understand them so that we can provide a sense of support. And if students aren't involved in anything, we can help connect them to create them for them that sense of belonging. So I want to just circle back to my friend Jesus. Connecting, engaging students has never been more important. We know that it's been important. We do this. We are excellent at it. but it's gotten really difficult with all the precautions that we're taking right now in schools. And understanding more about the brain science side of things, if I would have known this back then, this wasn't something that I had really thought about. I could have been way more intentional with students other than Jesus, right? Jesus, I really had a great impact on because I took the time to sit down and get to know him and understand him at a level that I knew what his triggers were. But really what we need to do is understand students as a whole, our classrooms as a whole, our schools as a whole, so that we can build relationships with our students. And the deeper that we get to know them, the more we know what triggers them, the better we can keep them in that reward state of mind. So my hope for you is that you'll begin to identify those triggers in your students as well as yourself. And with that, you'll be able to better support their emotional well-being and connect with them on a deeper level. One last note. I love this quote. It's the teacher that makes the difference, not the classroom. You create your classroom culture. You create the way that you sit with students, learn with students, teach students, have fun with students. You create that culture. So thank you for every single thing that you do. I know it has been a tremendously difficult year. You are all amazing. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions, my contact information is at the bottom of the slide, Danielle@studentumap.com. I'd love to have further conversation about brain science and threats and rewards. That QR code will also bring you to the 5 activities that I described for the SCARF model. So if you have any questions, reach out. Thank you so much for your time and have a great rest of the year.